It began on a day meant for romance, a day when expectations were high and every gesture shimmered with promise. That Valentine's Day, I broke up with Emily. Our parting was quiet, measured, and at the time, almost anticlimactic. I believed I was finally liberating both of us from a relationship that had grown stagnant. I never imagined that the decision would unleash something far more sinister than heartbreak, a curse that would forever haunt my future. I left Emily without any dramatic declarations or bitter words. Instead, I walked away with a heavy, numb resolve. I remember her tearful eyes as we said goodbye in that small cafe near her apartment. Her face was a mix of sorrow and something I couldn't quite decipher, an expression that, in hindsight, seemed to portend the tragedy to come. I never suspected that a week after that fateful day, Emily would die under mysterious circumstances, her life snuffed out as if extinguished by an unseen force. I learned of her death only much later, when whispers of a curse and ghostly apparitions began to plague me. In the days that followed our breakup, I clung to the hope of moving on. I tried to convince myself that time would heal the wound. I told myself that I would eventually forget the bittersweet memories of Emily. Instead, as the weeks slipped by, something far more terrifying began to happen. Every woman I dated, every woman I thought might help me put the past behind me, started to carry a disturbingly familiar quality. Their faces, their expressions, even their smallest gestures echoed something unmistakable. No matter how different they claimed to be, an uncanny resemblance always emerged, a spectral overlay that, for a fleeting moment, transformed their features into a mirror image of Emily's. I was first confronted by this phenomenon on my very first date after the breakup. I had arranged to meet Laura at a quaint bistro, tucked away on a quiet side street. Laura was soft-spoken and thoughtful, her eyes full of gentle humor as we discussed our favorite novels and local art exhibits. I recall that evening vividly, the warm glow of candlelight, the low murmur of conversation, and the clink of glasses filled with red wine. Yet amid this pleasant scene, I sensed something was amiss. As Laura laughed at one of my tentative jokes, there was a moment, a mere fraction of a second, when her expression shifted. For that split second, her smile and the delicate curve of her features seemed to distort into a sorrowful mimicry of Emily's own face. I blinked hard, and the moment was gone. I told myself it was simply the residue of my grief, a trick of my mind still reeling from the breakup. I tried to push it aside. After all, wasn't it normal for a heart freshly broken to see fragments of the past everywhere? I thought so. Yet, as I left the bistro that night, I had a feeling that something in the air had changed. Something inexplicable and foreboding that I could neither name nor understand. A few days later, I arranged a coffee date with Simone. The cafe was small, its windows streaked with the rain of an early spring afternoon. The steady rhythm of raindrops against the glass should have been soothing, a gentle lullaby to ease my troubled thoughts. Simone was lively and animated. She recounted stories of her childhood with an infectious enthusiasm that drew genuine smiles from both of us. But as she laughed, a bright, musical sound, the flash came again. In the briefest of instants, I saw in her eyes and the curl of her lips the unmistakable echo of Emily's melancholy smile. It was as if Simone's face had momentarily worn a mask that was not hers. I forced myself to concentrate on the unique cadence of Simone's voice, on the warmth that radiated from her when she spoke of her dreams. And yet the ghostly resemblance lingered in the corners of my vision. By the time the coffee cups were empty and the rain had stopped, I was left with a gnawing dread I couldn't explain. I attempted to rationalize the experiences. Perhaps my grief was distorting reality, causing my mind to superimpose Emily's features onto every new face. But the more dates I went on, the more relentless the phenomenon became. Soon it wasn't just Laura or Simone, it extended to every encounter I made. There was Nadia, whose vibrant passion for life had once ignited a spark in me on a crisp autumn evening. We met at a lively restaurant alive with the strains of a jazz band and the chatter of excited diners. Nadia's eyes shone as she described her latest artistic project, and her smile lit up the room. And yet, as we laughed together over shared memories of our favorite childhood songs, I was struck by an overwhelming familiarity. For a fleeting moment, Nadia's expression melded into the tender sadness I had once seen in Emily's eyes, a look that filled me with both warmth and terror. Then there was Marianne, whom I encountered at a local art exhibit. The gallery was a dim, enchanting space filled with vibrant canvases and abstract sculptures. Marianne's eyes sparkled with creative fire as she passionately described the interplay of light and shadow in one particularly evocative painting. I listened, enraptured by her insights, until I noticed something disturbingly odd. In the subtle play of light on Marianne's face, there emerged a ghostly outline, a delicate, ephemeral trace of Emily's features. It was as if Marianne's individuality was being overlaid with a spectral mask, a mask that belonged to the woman I had lost. For a moment, I doubted my own sanity. Had my grief truly conjured these hallucinations, or was something else at work? Desperation began to gnaw at me. I started keeping a journal, a battered leather notebook in which I documented every unsettling encounter in meticulous detail. I recorded the date, the location, the conversation, and most importantly, the exact moment when the ghostly transformation occurred. In entries scrawled in the early hours of sleepless nights, I described how the faces of each new date would, for an instant, betray an uncanny resemblance to Emily. The journal became a testament to my growing terror, a ledger of the curse I could neither understand nor escape. I remember one particularly harrowing entry about a date with Celeste. We had met for lunch at a small, sunlit cafe in the heart of the city. Celeste was full of life, with sparkling eyes and an effervescent laugh. As she spoke about her dreams of traveling the world, her face lit up with hope and passion. But then it happened again. In a split second, as the sunlight played across her features, the contours of her face softened and shifted, and I saw, just for a heartbeat, the sorrowful expression that had once been Emily's. The realization was shattering. It was not a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. It was as if Emily's very essence had seeped into the fabric of every new relationship I tried to forge. At first, I tried to dismiss it all as the natural byproduct of unresolved grief. I told myself that my mind, desperate to cling to the past, was merely superimposing a familiar face onto every new woman. But as the encounters multiplied, the rational explanations began to crumble. I found myself questioning everything. Every time I looked into a new face, I wondered if I was seeing the unique personality of the person before me, or merely a ghostly projection of Emily. Desperate for answers, I sought help from a therapist renowned for her work with unusual cases of grief and trauma. In our sessions, I recounted every detail: the dates with Laura, Simone, Nadia, Marianne, Celeste, and even others I could scarcely remember by name. I confessed that every woman I dated bore the spectral imprint of Emily. My therapist listened intently, her brow furrowing as she tried to reconcile my experiences with her understanding of grief-induced hallucinations. "Sometimes," she said softly, "our minds cling to what we've lost in ways we cannot fully control. But what you describe, this recurring, precise image. It almost seems as if something supernatural is at play. Her words, meant to soothe me, instead deepened the sense of dread that had settled in my bones. I began to wonder if my breakup had unleashed something far more sinister than simple heartache. Had my decision to let go of Emily inadvertently torn a hole in the fabric between life and death? I started to research old folklore and local legends, scouring libraries and obscure websites for any reference to curses born of lost love. I read of times where the untimely death of a lover could leave a lingering, vengeful spirit, an echo that would haunt the living. The more I read, the more convinced I became that something malevolent had attached itself to me. Late one night, as I sat hunched over my journal in the dim glow of a single lamp, I received a phone call from a mutual friend. His voice trembled as he delivered the news I had been dreading. Emily had died. He explained that she had fallen mysteriously ill just a week after our breakup, and despite her struggle, she passed away quietly in her sleep. The news hit me like a tidal wave. I felt an overwhelming mix of guilt, sorrow, and terror. If Emily was truly dead, and if my mind wasn't merely fabricating these ghostly apparitions, then what did it mean that every woman I dated was now haunted by her image? I began to connect the dots in my journal. The pattern was undeniable. Every time I tried to forge a new connection, I was confronted with a spectral echo of Emily's face. It wasn't a simple case of nostalgia or grief-induced delusion. It was as if her spirit had latched onto me, a curse that refused to let go of what had been lost. I started to view every date as a macabre reenactment of our love, a ritual in which I was forced to relive the grief, the guilt, and the horror of her untimely death. One chilly evening, I met Angela, a kind-hearted woman with soulful eyes, at a quiet wine bar. We talked about our shared love for classic literature and the quiet magic of rainy afternoons. For a while, I was able to lose myself in the conversation, but as the night deepened, I felt that dreaded moment approach. And then it happened. As Angela smiled gently at a story I was telling, her features softened and blurred, and for a split second, I saw the delicate lines of Emily's face staring back at me. My heart pounded, and I felt as though I were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The terror that gripped me was not merely of losing the possibility of new love. It was the realization that the specter of Emily had become an inescapable part of my existence. Every date, every fleeting connection was tainted by the haunting presence of a woman I had once loved, and whose death had left behind a curse that defied explanation. I became increasingly isolated. Nights grew long and sleepless, filled with nightmares of Emily's ghost drifting through dark corridors, her eyes pleading for release even as they tormented me with their sorrow. In the following weeks, I met more women. Elise, a quiet soul I encountered at a friend's intimate gathering. Rachel, a spirited entrepreneur whose confidence and laughter briefly illuminated the darkness. And Victoria, a soft-spoken, introspective woman I had hoped might help me rebuild my shattered heart. But with each new encounter, the horror repeated itself. Even when I tried to embrace the uniqueness of each woman, the curse intruded. Their features would momentarily betray the spectral imprint of Emily, the same tilt of the head, the same haunted glimmer in the eyes, the same inexplicable sadness that belonged to someone I could no longer save. I found myself spiraling deeper into despair. I began to question my sanity. Was it possible that my grief had conjured a living nightmare, or was I truly cursed, doomed to be haunted by the ghost of my lost love until I found a way to break the hold it had over me? In my desperation, I turned to rituals and old lore. I scoured antique bookshops and obscure archives for any mention of a curse that could manifest in such a way. I read accounts of lovers separated by death, of spirits that would cling to the living in an attempt to rewrite fate. In one tattered volume of local folklore, I found a story that chilled me to the core. A tale of a woman whose untimely demise left her soul unmoored, destined to wander until a final act of absolution was performed. The idea took root in my mind. Perhaps the only way to break the curse was to confront the ghost of Emily, to understand the unresolved agony that had bound her to my world. Thus began a journey into the darkest recesses of my own heart. I began to study meditation and mindfulness, trying to prepare myself for a confrontation with the supernatural. I reached out to paranormal investigators and even attended a weekly meditation group whose members claimed to have seen spirits. Each meeting was a struggle against the encroaching despair that had become my constant companion. I was determined, if not to break the curse, then at least to understand it. I needed to know why every new face was marked by Emily's ghostly imprint. One chilly autumn evening, I decided to put my resolve to the test. I arranged one final date with Victoria, a woman whose quiet intellect and gentle humor had once kindled a spark of hope in me. We agreed to meet in a moonlit park, a place where the boundary between light and shadow felt thin enough to be penetrated by secrets. As we walked along the winding paths beneath towering ancient trees, I mustered all the courage I could find. I wanted to see if I could, by sheer force of will, resist the curse and see Victoria as her own person. For a long while, the evening seemed to offer a reprieve. Victoria spoke softly about her dreams and fears, her voice blending with the rustle of leaves in the cool night air. I listened intently, searching for any sign of the spectral intrusion that had tormented me for so long. My heart pounded as I waited, each moment stretching out like an eternity. Then, as if testing my resolve, it happened. In a heartbeat, as Victoria smiled in response to a tender memory, her face began to shift. I could see the ghostly contours emerge, a flicker of that all too familiar sadness, the subtle arch of her eyebrows transforming into the expression I had known so well. For a moment, I was paralyzed by horror. Was it too late? Was I doomed to be haunted by her spirit forever? Victoria's eyes widened in confusion as she noticed my sudden stillness. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I struggled to force words from my trembling lips. I need a moment," I managed to say, retreating away from her gaze. I could feel the weight of the curse bearing down on me, an invisible force twisting the very fabric of our interaction. Under the ghostly glow of a flickering street lamp, I stepped away from Victoria, my heart heavy with despair and resignation. That night, as I returned home beneath a sky swollen with storm clouds, I knew that something had to change. I could no longer accept that every new connection would be marred by the spectral presence of Emily. I spent hours pacing the dim corridors of my apartment, poring over my journal and rereading every entry with a mix of terror and determination. I was resolved to break this curse, to free myself from the relentless ghost that haunted every woman I dated, and in doing so, free Emily's spirit from its tortured bondage. In the days that followed, I delved deeper into the mysteries of the supernatural. I contacted a local medium, a woman named Lillian, whose reputation for communicating with the departed was well known among those who sought answers beyond the veil. Lillian agreed to meet with me in the quiet sanctuary of her candlelit parlor, a room heavy with incense and the weight of unspoken secrets. As she listened to my story, each detail of my haunted dates, each instance of that uncanny resemblance, Her eyes grew wide with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "Your grief has not only wounded you," Lillian said softly, "but it has also opened a doorway for her spirit." Emily's death was not natural. It was as if fate herself intervened to claim her. And in your final moments together, something unresolved was left behind. Her spirit is tethered to you, desperate for closure or for the recognition of what she lost. I felt as though a cold hand had grasped my heart. "Are you saying she's haunting me?" I asked. Lillian nodded gravely. "Not just you. I have heard similar stories from others who have suffered a profound loss, a soul that departs too soon, when the love remains unspoken or unfinished, can manifest as a curse. It latches onto the living, distorting reality so that every new relationship becomes a mirror of what was lost." Her words, though heavy with despair, sparked a flicker of hope in me. Perhaps there was a way to put an end to this torment. Lillian suggested a ritual, a final act of closure that might sever the tie between Emily's restless spirit and my life. It would require me to confront the ghost directly, to speak aloud the truth of what remained unsaid between us. I would have to find the courage to face the specter of my lost love and, in doing so, grant her the peace that had eluded her in life. The idea both terrified and compelled me. I spent nights poring over my journal, revisiting every memory of Emily. The soft cadence of her laughter, the warmth of her hand, the light in her eyes that had once filled me with hope. I recalled the moments of tenderness and regret, the words left unsaid, and I began to write a letter addressed to her ghost. In that letter, I poured out my remorse, my longing for closure, and my desperate plea for forgiveness. I admitted that I had been selfish in walking away, that I had never truly understood the depth of our connection until it was too late. I begged her to find peace, to release me from the curse that had chained us both to a never-ending cycle of torment. Armed with this letter and a tentative resolve, I set a date for the ritual. I arranged to meet Lillian one final time in her candlelit parlor. The night of the ritual was overcast and stormy, the sky dark and threatening as if mourning a great loss. In the hush of that sacred space, Lillian guided me through the ceremony. I was instructed to recite the letter aloud, to speak my truth into the silent air, and to allow the words to carry my sorrow, my guilt, and my hope for redemption. My voice shook as I read the letter, each word an agonizing confession of what I had left undone. As the final words echoed into the stillness, I felt an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. A gentle stirring, as though a long imprisoned soul was finally exhaling after years of torment. In the days that followed, I braced myself for a change. I returned to dating, though with a heart still heavy with uncertainty. I met Elise at a quiet dinner at a friend's gathering, Rachel at an art fair buzzing with creative energy, and even Victoria again, in a softly lit park under a sky full of stars. And with each new encounter, I watched and waited. For a while, I began to notice small differences. On one date with Elise, as she laughed over a shared joke, I observed her face, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw only Elise. There was no spectral overlay, no ghostly echo of Emily. It was as if the curse was receding, yielding if only slightly. Yet, the horror was not entirely banished. There were still fleeting moments, a glance here, a smile there, when the familiar sadness would ripple across a face for an instant. Each time I felt a pang of terror, as though the ghost of Emily were still lurking in the shadows of my heart. I documented these occurrences in my journal with meticulous detail, noting the time, the setting, the subtle changes in the woman's expression. Slowly, I began to see a pattern. The curse was not vanishing altogether. It was receding, fluctuating with the intensity of my own emotions. When I felt hopeful and resolved, the spectral echoes diminished. But on nights when doubt and grief crept in, they returned with a vengeance. The struggle became a constant battle between light and darkness, a fight for my own soul. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced I had seen Emily's eyes staring at me from the darkness of my room. I found myself obsessively checking my reflection in mirrors and windows, half expecting to see that ghostly countenance superimposed upon the face of whoever I was with. Friends noticed my pallor, my distracted demeanor, and some even urged me to seek help beyond therapy. But the curse was deeply personal, a torment born of love, loss, and regret. No one else could understand the horror of watching every new relationship become a twisted echo of what had been lost. As autumn gave way to winter, the nights grew longer and colder, and the curse's grip on my life became ever more insidious. I went on a series of dates, each one a desperate attempt to reclaim a sense of normalcy. I met Celeste again, whose vibrant laughter once again turned to that heart-wrenching glimpse of Emily's sorrowful eyes. I met Angela once more, and even with every effort to see them as separate individuals, the curse reasserted itself in a moment of quiet vulnerability. It was as if the spirit of Emily was determined to be with me, refusing to let me forget her, refusing to let me love without the constant reminder of what had been irrevocably shattered. I began to wonder if I was doomed to a fate worse than eternal loneliness, a fate in which every new connection was tainted by an inescapable specter. The horror of it all was not simply in the images themselves, but in what they represented. The relentless, unyielding grip of a love that had been lost too soon, and the terrible price of that loss. My heart ached with every reminder, every time a new woman I encountered was marred by the ghost of Emily. I felt trapped in a labyrinth of my own making, where every path led back to her. One bitter winter evening, as the wind howled outside and snow blanketed the silent city, I found myself alone in my apartment. I sat at my desk, journal open, surrounded by scraps of paper and the remnants of a life once filled with hope. I stared at the blank page, searching for a way to break the cycle, to banish the curse that had taken root in my very soul. I wondered if there was any redemption to be found, any way to free both myself and the spirit that haunted me. In that lonely moment, I resolved that I would not let the curse define my future. I would fight it with every fiber of my being, even if it meant facing the most unspeakable horrors. In the weeks that followed, I immersed myself in research and ritual. I revisited every piece of lore Lillian had shared, every story of lost love turned malevolent. I studied ancient rites, whispered incantations meant to sever the bonds between the living and the dead. I even reached out to others who claimed to have experienced similar hauntings. Their stories were as varied as they were terrifying, a tapestry of sorrow, regret, and spectral vengeance that confirmed my darkest suspicions, that when love dies before it is allowed to fade naturally, the result is a curse that binds the past to the present in a way that defies reason. Slowly, a plan began to form. A final confrontation that I hoped might finally release me from the relentless horror. I would need to gather my strength and confront the ghost of Emily one last time, in the place where it all began. I decided to return to that small cafe where we had first said goodbye, where the seed of this curse had been inadvertently sown. Under the guise of revisiting old memories, I arranged to meet a friend there, a friend who had once known both of us well, and might offer some insight into the inexplicable events that had followed. That evening, as I sat in the dim light of the familiar cafe, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The room was quiet, the soft murmur of distant conversation and the clinking of cups blending with my racing thoughts. I closed my eyes and recalled the moment of our breakup, the quiet resignation in Emily's eyes, the unspoken promise that things would change. I wondered if, in that moment, I had unknowingly sealed our fates. A sudden chill swept through the room, and I opened my eyes to see, for the briefest of instants, the spectral figure of Emily reflected in the window. Her eyes, filled with an endless sorrow, seemed to meet mine. I could almost hear her silent plea, a desperate cry for forgiveness or perhaps for release. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving me trembling and determined. That night, I returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. I spent hours preparing for the confrontation, reviewing every detail of the rituals I had learned, every incantation that promised to sever the unholy bond between her spirit and my future. I wrote one final letter, a letter addressed not only to Emily's ghost but to the curse itself. In that letter, I poured out all my guilt, all my sorrow, and all my longing for closure. I acknowledged my role in our broken love and begged for the release of both our souls from this torment. Armed with the letter and a small collection of ritual items, a faded photograph of Emily, a candle inscribed with ancient symbols, and a vial of water from a sacred spring, I prepared for the final act. I arranged to perform the ritual on a cold, moonless night when the veil between the living and the dead was said to be at its thinnest. I chose the place where it all began, the abandoned ruins of an old chapel on the outskirts of the city, a place steeped in both beauty and decay. The night of the ritual arrived bleak and oppressive. I made my way to the ruins, my footsteps echoing in the desolate silence. The ancient stone walls loomed around me, their surfaces marked by time and sorrow. I lit the candle and set it on a flat stone altar in the center of a small, overgrown courtyard. My heart pounded as I read the letter aloud, my voice trembling in the darkness. I recited each word with painstaking care, as though the very act of speaking my truth might shatter the curse that had bound me for so long. As I reached the final lines, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the candle, plunging me into inky darkness. In that moment, I felt a presence, an almost tangible force pressing against my chest, filling the silence with a low, mournful hum. I could see, if only for a moment, the faint outline of a figure standing at the edge of the courtyard. I could see her eyes, so achingly familiar, and I knew without a doubt that it was Emily's spirit, come to claim the final toll of our doomed love. Time seemed to slow. Every second stretched into an eternity as I stood frozen, caught between terror and the desperate need for closure. The figure drew nearer, its features indistinct, yet filled with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to speak. "Emily," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I never meant for it to end like this. Please let me help you find peace." For a heartbeat, the air was still. Then the figure spoke in a voice that was both distant and intimate, a voice that seemed to carry the weight of every unsaid word, every moment of regret. "I am lost," it said, the words echoing around the ruins. "I am bound by a love that could not be saved." The sound of her voice was a lament, a sorrowful dirge that resonated deep within me. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. "Then let me set you free," I pleaded, my words desperate and raw. "I know I hurt you, I know I abandoned you, but I want to let go of this curse. I want both of us to be free." As the final syllables left my lips, a surge of wind roared through the courtyard, scattering leaves and debris into a swirling frenzy. The darkness around me seemed to tremble, and for a long, agonizing moment, I could feel the presence of Emily's spirit all around me, close, yet impossibly distant. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the presence began to fade. The oppressive weight lifted and a sense of sorrowful release washed over me. In that moment, I felt a quiet resolve settle in my heart, as if the ghost had finally been granted the closure it so desperately sought. I remained there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence that followed, the silence of a spirit finally at peace and a curse slowly receding into the night. When I finally rose to leave, I knew that the journey was not entirely over. The haunting images might still appear in moments of vulnerability, and the scars of that tortured love would linger. But I had taken the first, vital step toward breaking the curse that had chained my future to a love lost too soon. In the months that followed, I continued to date. I approached each new encounter with a cautious optimism, determined to see each woman for who she truly was, rather than a vessel for Emily's ghost. There were still moments, brief flashes during a shared laugh or a thoughtful glance, when I would see the sorrowful imprint of her face. But gradually, those moments grew less frequent, and I began to feel a lightness I had not known in years. I met Elise again at a small community event, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw only Elise. Her eyes shone with a warmth that was entirely her own. I went on a date with Rachel at an art fair, where the vibrant colors and joyful chatter of the crowd overwhelmed any lingering shadows of the past. Even Victoria, with whom I had once faced the full terror of the curse, began to appear solely as herself, an individual of quiet grace and gentle humor. I still carried the memories of the horror, the relentless fear that every new romance was doomed to be haunted by Emily's spectral presence. But with each passing day, as I forged connections built on genuine affection rather than the echoes of a lost love, I began to reclaim my life. Every new face was a reminder of what I had endured, a dark chapter that had scarred my heart, but it also taught me the value of forgiveness, closure, and the unyielding resilience of the human spirit. I continued to document my experiences, not as a lament of the past, but as a chronicle of my journey toward healing. The battered leather journal, once filled with desperate entries and haunting images, slowly transformed into a record of hope, a testament to the idea that even the most cursed love could eventually give way to new beginnings. Though the curse was never entirely banished, a lingering shadow sometimes crossed my vision on stormy nights or in the quiet moments before dawn. I learned to live with it. I learned to accept that some scars never fully fade, that the echoes of a tragic past can remain even as new love takes root. And I came to understand that my story, no matter how haunted or tormented, was not defined solely by loss. It was defined by the courage to face the darkness, to confront the ghosts that bound me, and to continue moving forward in search of redemption. Now, as I sit at my desk in the gentle light of an early spring morning, I glance at my journal with a bittersweet smile. I remember Emily, not as the specter that once haunted every new face I encountered, but as the woman I once loved whose life ended too soon. I remember the terror, the sorrow, and the curse that bound me, but I also remember the hard-fought victory of breaking that unholy tether. Every date I now experience, every genuine connection I build, is a small act of defiance against a past that once threatened to consume me entirely. I share this story in the hope that those who have been haunted by the ghosts of lost love might find solace and courage. Sometimes the pain of loss can manifest in ways that defy explanation, a supernatural force that binds us to memories we wish we could forget. But even in the depths of such horror, there remains the possibility of healing, of redemption, and of forging a future that is truly our own. As I continue on this winding path, I know that there will still be nights when I see a flicker of a familiar face, a ghostly imprint that reminds me of what I have endured. But I also know that I have learned to cherish the beauty of each individual moment, a smile that is truly genuine, a laugh that is entirely unique, and the promise that every new love holds the potential to heal even the deepest wounds. In the end, the curse that began on that fateful Valentine's Day when I broke up with Emily became both a haunting reminder of a love lost and a catalyst for my own transformation. It forced me to confront the dark recesses of my heart and to emerge, scarred but stronger, ready to embrace the future. And though the specter of Emily may still linger at the edges of my vision from time to time, I now understand that love, true, unburdened love, can be found again, even after the darkest of nights.